Last week, my children were begging me to take them to the pool on a beautiful 90-degree day like today. I kept putting them off, and I kept saying, I have to prepare a 45-minute speech for the conference next week. My 9-year-old daughter said, who wants to listen to anybody speak for 45 minutes? The girl had a point. So, accepting her wisdom, I'm going to try not to speak for 45 minutes, although I'll confess I'm a little chatty by nature. But I will tell you about my mother-in-law, Leigh Lowe, founder of Memoria Press and Highlands Latin School. I'll give you the history of Memoria Press, and I'll discuss how the content and culture of the Memoria Press curriculum support the unequaled value of classical education. The Memoria Press story begins loosely in the year 2000, the date we use for our founding. I say loosely because the school essentially started in the Lowe family living room. In many ways, however, the story of Memoria Press starts in Western Kentucky with my father-in-law, Jim Lowe, instead of my mother-in-law, Cheryl Lowe. When I read that sentence to my husband last week, he said, oh man, how far do we have to go back here? But please bear with me. Mr. Lowe grew up on a farm in rural Kentucky where he was the youngest of 4 boys, and he lived a wholesome, if austere, life without electricity or running water. He woke before dawn to milk the cows. He rode in a horse-drawn buggy to church on Sundays. And on cold, windy nights, he filled the slats in the house that his father built with pages from the Sears Roebuck catalog. There was a shared telephone in the Lowe family house that rang for their family and also all the neighbors. And everything that the Lowe family consumed was either grown or raised or caught on their farm, with the exception of flour and sugar. They farmed with a team of mules until my father-in-law was around 10, we think. And he claims that the first time he rode in a car was at age 15 when he went to Louisville to attend his brother's wedding. Now, I know you're thinking, yeah, we all have heard of Little House on the Prairie, but this was the 1950s. While my father-in-law was tapping trees for syrup, the rest of the world was watching Happy Days on their TVs and zooming off to sock hops in convertibles. Jim Lowe's father, Gifford, was the schoolmaster for the county. He taught his own children and the neighboring children in a one-room schoolhouse. His influence on the community was profound. He was responsible for teaching the children everything they needed to know for the statewide 8th grade test that moved them on to high school. He was also responsible for teaching them what they needed to know to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing world. He taught his students the trees, the flowers, animals, landscapes, not only for pastoral romantic reasons, but because they needed food, shelter, and water. He taught them where the creeks and the rivers flowed. He taught them how the hills and the mountains formed. He taught them arithmetic, history, and handwriting. He also taught them poetry, music, and literature to form their hearts. My children are fascinated by the stories of their grandfather's education. They envision him running to school with a lunch pail and an armful of books, as he did. They're perplexed when he explains that they had to stoke the fire and carry coal to the schoolhouse to keep it warm. And they giggle when Granddad says that patience was an absolute necessity in that one-room school. Not because you had to wait your turn for the teacher, but because students often forgot to flip the cardboard sign by the back door when returning from the outhouse. Cheryl Lowe was also enamored by the farm, and she had a deep respect for her husband's childhood. It was a bit of a family joke, however, that Mrs. Lowe loved farming so much. That's because when she was on the farm, she spent all of her time reading, never farming. Next to her desk in the garage office, Brian taped a picture of an elegant woman in a beautiful black dress in pearls, sitting daintily on a stool next to a cow. He contended that was his mother's idea of farming. What was real was her appreciation for Gifford Lowe's one-room school. It was even something of a model for HLS in our early years when classes were cobbled together and teachers were few. There is a lot to love in that example. A schoolmaster who knows his students well and shepherds them through every grade and every subject. A setting that requires the teacher to maintain order, and the students to stay patient and respectful. A classroom where older students are mentors and good examples, and younger students are stretched and prepared by overhearing what's ahead of them. If our pride will allow it, we would do well to recognize in that unsuspecting one-room school with a standout teacher that existed nearly 75 years ago, a great example for us. My no-nonsense father-in-law recently said to me, "People often try to change things that don't need to change. Maybe it's because they're trying to seek personal recognition. Maybe it's simply because they're bored. It takes discipline and humility to acknowledge what has already been done well and to simply stick with it." Cheryl Lowe recognized what was excellent about that one-room schoolhouse. As she studied schools and education over the course of her lifetime, she constantly disciplined herself to notice what worked well and then figure out how to accomplish it. That ultimately led us here, a conference on classical education. We are not gathered here because Cheryl Lowe reinvented the wheel. We are gathered here because she resisted the fads of the time and had the conviction and courage to repeatedly notice and retain what was good when it came to forming young minds. It helped that my mother-in-law was also brilliant and indefatigable. She had a passion for education and an inborn gift for teaching. She nurtured her blessings through study, both formally and informally. Her bachelor and master's degrees were in education, chemistry, and biology. And later, after teaching high school chemistry and geometry, she went back to school for minors in religion, math, and astronomy. She also began a comprehensive self-study of the history of education. She taught herself Latin to mastery, and she read literature and history voraciously. There was essentially no area of our curriculum where she was not expert. The motivation for Highlands Latin School came when it was time to educate her two sons, Andy and Brian. Mrs. Lowe tried a variety of schools in the area, but never found exactly what she was seeking. She never found the education she knew used to exist. Eventually, she would undertake the task herself and bring her sons home to school them at her house. While homeschooling, she discovered and mastered Latin, the indispensable subject for training young minds. Latin orders the language arts in the way math orders the sciences. Mrs. Lowe fell in love with Latin and wanted to share her joy with others. The prevalence of Latin grammar had somewhat been lost, so she wrote her own Latin program to make the subject accessible to young students. This program was Latina Christiana, and it was the basis for the Memoria Press curriculum. After teaching herself and her boys Latin, she decided that it was time to share her knowledge with other homeschooling families. Reminiscent of the one-room schoolhouse, she set up little wooden desks in her living room and would have class next to the fireplace and the big wall of windows overlooking the koi pond in the backyard. When the school year ended, there would be ceremonies for her students in the rose garden. Mr. Lowe would cook his famous ribs on the grill, and Mrs. Lowe would make skillet cornbread, coleslaw, and banana pudding, her favorite. With all the families together, she would praise each student individually for their academic accomplishments and also the unique contributions they gave to our community. Speaking about each individual student for a few minutes is still a tradition that exists at the Highlands Latin School graduation. Mrs. Lowe was a master teacher and serious about instruction, but her school environment was warm and charming. As is the case with everything that is truly exceptional, word spread, and Mrs. Lowe's living room school soon had 27 students. Space eventually became an issue, and I would venture a guess that Mr. Lowe occasionally wanted to watch a ball game without moving a mobile chalkboard. So at this point, Mrs. Lowe expanded and rented 2 classrooms in a local church and offered a one-day, 4-hour-a-week Latin and classical studies program for homeschooling families. Older students took advanced Latin, Roman, and Greek history with Mrs. Lowe, and I, not yet married or even engaged to her son Brian, was to teach Latin, Greek mythology, and Roman history to the younger students. Now, this was a real leap of faith for both of us, for many reasons, but not least of which was that I didn't know Latin or Greek mythology or Roman history at that time. But nonetheless, I quit my full-time job and took a 4-hour-a-week teaching position. Mrs. Lowe wasn't at all concerned about my inexperience. In fact, she praised the fact that she just had to train me and not retrain me. That's what she said anyway. She would teach me everything I needed to know. We had Latin classes in the garage attic, and once I passed garage Latin, I got my first class with 10 students. The students ranged in age from 2nd to 8th grade. We had 1 4-hour block and 0 materials, with the exception of the books we were supposed to teach. What I would have given to get the current Memoria Press teacher manuals, curriculum guides, and student workbooks. In fact, that's how those came to be, out of pure necessity. Interestingly, though, even though our school was small and limited, something special and meaningful was happening, and it was apparent to everyone involved. What was happening was true education, direction toward truth, beauty, and goodness. It was real, and it was rewarding in a way that felt invigorating and refreshing. Howland's Latin School continued to grow from the 2-classroom space despite our simple shared facilities, despite our unusual schedule, despite our limited course offerings, and despite our old-fashioned multi-age classrooms. To me, that says loudly that classical education satisfies a heart's desire. This education responds to a need in our culture. Mrs. Lowe was the master teacher, the model for us all. She believed that classroom instruction was the most important job in a school, so she always put aside administrative duties to go into classrooms and teach. But that didn't mean she ignored the small details. She sought excellence in everything. She was absolutely hands-on with everything that happened at her school and in her curriculum. One year, she spent an entire summer scaling family recipes and then 6 months working in the school cafeteria cooking. She insisted on homemade desserts. She looked up the yeast roll recipe from her own school days. And she introduced spaghetti with bacon, which was a dish she loved from her travels to Italy. She oversaw her curriculum scrupulously as well, constantly eliminating busy work and refining tests and guides. She regularly walked around classrooms checking every student's pencil grip, and if you happen to be a grandchild of hers, a surprise grip check could happen at any time, including Christmas morning. She was always scrutinizing and perfecting. On the morning she passed away in June 2017, she was working on her trees book to make sure that all the new trees on our campus were represented. Howland's Latin School moved to its 3rd and current rented location, our beautiful Crescent Hill campus, in 2004. We purchased this 20-acre Spring Meadows campus in 2009, and last year we were pleased to add a 3rd campus in Indiana just across the Ohio River. Next year, HLS will have close to 700 students, and Memoria Press now offers essentially a K-12 classical curriculum for schools and homeschools all over the country. Of course, we are humbled to serve so many, but let me say that rapid expansion was never the goal. As both Memoria Press and Howland's Latin School grew, we were constantly reminded of the words of Wendell Berry. We were directed to grow like a tree, not like a fire. We should not sacrifice quality for size, and we were cautioned to protect our curriculum and our culture with vigilance. Mrs. Lowe often told us, knowledge without virtue is dangerous. This made us careful stewards of our goals and our priorities. We are blessed that Cheryl Lowe was so exacting when it came to implementing her curriculum and her vision of a classical Christian education. She had courage and common sense. She said the things that needed to be said, often the things we knew in our hearts or saw plainly but just couldn't articulate. She was brilliant, she was humble, and she was absolutely nonstop. We are fortunate to have been under her meticulous scrutiny for so many years, but now it's our turn to continue her legacy. We can do it. In fact, we must do it. Though she is no longer with us, Cheryl Lowe taught us well. If she were giving a test, I believe these are the 5 points that she would have wanted us to master about classical education. First, classical education offers not only knowledge, but wisdom. The goal of a classical education is to put forth well-prepared students who have been shown through rich and rigorous coursework to place service above self. An educated person should, by breadth of knowledge and experience, seek what is true, good, and beautiful, and likewise have the conviction to resist what is not. This used to be the goal of classical education. It's important to know that while classical education may seem new and exceptional today, it's not. Classical education simply is restoring a standard that was lost. What we now have to denote as classical education used to simply be called education. In the traditional classical model, being educated means something objective. Content is not subject to the whimsical standards or temporary fancies of the time. A classical education is an education that shares a body of knowledge with its ancestors and hopes to pass that culture on to future generations. To have a classical education, a student has learned Latin, probably Greek. They have a thorough understanding of ancient history and cultures. They have read from the canon of great books broadly. A classically educated student has an increasingly rare understanding of his past and unlimited potential regarding his future. He has also developed the humility and gratitude that accompanies high academic achievement and the recognition that there is always a lot more to learn. Classical education is intentional. Our students are given the same rich educational experience as their forebears. I like to point out that the Memoria Press curriculum was well planned within the traditional classical framework. Our 12th grade program was developed first, based on the high standards of the past. Our upper school program is the crowning jewel of the Memoria Press education. It is the reward for the diligent training and preparation done in the lower school. I like to talk about 12th grade first because I think it's important to identify the finish line before taking off at the start. How does one know if he or she has arrived if one has no idea where he or she is going? For that matter, how does one even know they're in the right race? If our students will be reading Dante in full, as did students of centuries past, what must be read in preparation? If they will be taking calculus, when must algebra be tackled? When should we master math facts? With this approach, kindergarten was the last grade we designed. We start in kindergarten from scratch, though, but with a pace that affords foundational mastery in the early grades and steady progress to a predetermined educational summit. To achieve this, our curriculum is not merely a collection of well-meaning parts. Lessons are not held to the constraints of subject or grade. Ours is a cohesive plan that exalts connectedness, and it pursues an identifiable end, not just an academic pinnacle, but more importantly, a whole, beautiful, thoughtful person, cognizant of his duty to contribute to the world and confident in his ability to do so. Though sometimes perceived this way, classical education should not be reserved for prodigies or the elite. At Memoria Press, we believe all people are worthy of its ends, truth, beauty, and goodness. We think classical education should be available to all who seek it. So our goal has always been to provide a classical education that is accessible. In our curriculum, we start with the letter A. We start with the number 0. We read The Little Red Hen. We practice tracing our names. We recite Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Though our expectations are high, we carefully prepare students for each rung on the ladder. We have mapped out a curriculum that conscientiously enables all students to achieve within the classical tradition, even if goals may vary. Number 2, Latin is the essential core of a classical education. Let me say that again. Latin is the essential core of a classical education. Latin plus the civilizations of Greece and Rome has defined classical education for over 2,000 years. This standard has been set. We believe Latin must be studied to justify the word classical in classical Christian education. You will see in our curriculum that students begin Latin in 2nd grade and continue with Latin grammar and translation through 12th grade. Why is there such an emphasis on Latin? Simply put, there is no other subject that trains the mind and integrates the skills necessary to learn all subjects like Latin. It offers a structure and system to the language arts in the way math orders the sciences. It is orderly, it is cumulative, it is systematic in a way that English is not. Latin teaches English grammar better than English because it offers comparison and objectivity. Students have a hard time understanding what is second nature to them. English grammar, then, is significantly easier to learn when it is objectively compared, especially to a language as regular as Latin. Latin allows students to step away from the ingrained knowledge they have of their own language and observe it in a new way. Dissecting sentences and identifying parts of speech to apply endings, which is a necessary part of Latin study, reinforces English grammar and requires students to understand language deeply. Latin also teaches young students an invaluable formula for learning. Latin language training processes systematically with clearly defined milestones. Students cannot move on to the next step, be it a new declensions or a new set of conjugation endings, until they have mastered the one before. This is an intrinsic value of Latin. In this way, Latin is both self-limiting and self-promoting. Latin also requires drill work. It requires repetition and consistency. Most importantly, Latin requires students to mentally organize information into readily accessible groups. It builds knowledge and instills intellectual discipline. What could be more beneficial to young minds than a model for breaking down information into digestible portions and then persevering until mastery is achieved? This skill is valuable for any field of study. Latin is also invaluable when it comes to vocabulary development. Latin is the mother language of English, thus providing over half of our vocabulary. And not just any half, the advanced half, the difficult half. Most of the 3- and 4-syllable words and up in English come from Latin. Consider teaching a Latin student consider teaching a primary student the number 3, then casually mentioning the prefix tri. The student can easily recognize how words like triangle, tricycle, triplet are related. But they are also now prepared to consider the meaning of words like trident, triceratops, or trimester. This ability to extrapolate vocabulary is of enormous value. It cultivates students who are masters of the spoken and written word. We find it surprising that Latin is sometimes criticized as impractical. We hear questions like, why study a dead language? Why not spend time on job skills? To that we say, please name a job skill that is more important than articulate, accurate, intelligent communication. Furthermore, Latin is the root of modern languages, Spanish, French, Italian. So students of Latin usually pick these languages up easily too. Tanya Charlton even volunteered that her son, when he was studying Japanese, credited Latin with his ability to learn that quickly because he had such an ingrained knowledge of language. Modern naysayers should know that Latin is also utterly embedded in a STEM education. It is the language of all the sciences. It provides the nomenclature for biology, chemistry, math. It is the language of medicine and law. Latin demands careful, detailed thinking, which translates to all learning. It is ubiquitous in the body of knowledge common to educated persons throughout history, and it's peppered into modern communication in abundance as well. Its educational value cannot be overstated. No other subject offers as much. That's why Latin is the core of our curriculum. All right, number 3. Classical education thrives in a traditional classroom. Traditional refers to the pedagogy or implementation of a curriculum. Classical, Christian, and traditional make sense together, but surprisingly aren't seen together that often. We think the marriage of classical curriculum and traditional classrooms are invaluable to success. An orderly curriculum just belongs in an orderly classroom. We desire for our students not simply knowledge, but wisdom, and not only content, but character. Content, character, culture. These can be considered 3 pillars of the classical education. Everything must stay aligned lest things come crashing down. Consider the difference in the manners and discourse of your family at a formal meal, say Christmas dinner with silver, crystal, china, versus pizza night on paper plates with paper plates and paper napkins. I can say for my family at least that far fewer things go airborne at Christmas. People often rise or fall according to the environment in which they are placed. So of course, the value of a history lesson on discipline, order, perseverance of the Romans is exponentially bolstered when the students are sitting attentively at a desk, in tidy uniforms, listening respectfully to the teacher. The environment models the lesson, and vice versa. It's obvious. Traditional education emphasizes order, memorization, and mastery. A school that prioritizes mastery does not offer cursory overviews or surveys of a subject. Slow, thoughtful attention is required of the books prioritized in the curriculum. In a single course, students study a limited number of texts, but they are trained from the very beginning to delve deeply and recognize every morsel of goodness. Quick surveys leave the student unfulfilled. The student trained to mastery learns that if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing well. Mastery demonstrates that patience and perseverance promote not only learning a subject, but more importantly, loving it. When students read Charlotte's Web, they should live at Zuckerman's farm. When they read Heidi, the Swiss Alps should be their playground. If they're learning trees and signs, they should be encouraged to notice every single one. Learning about 3 trees helps a student appreciate his yard. Learning about 100 trees enables a student to appreciate God's miraculous creation. Here's the point. Mastery education ennobles both the student and the subject. In a traditional school, mastery is possible when classrooms are led by knowledgeable, enthusiastic teachers who are models of behavior and character. When instruction is well-designed, age-appropriate, content-driven, and students learn that contributions to class discussion should be meaningful to maximize learning. Leigh Lowe frequently charged us to be careful, jealous stewards of classroom time because time on task is the most reliable predictor of increased learning. That's so important that I'm going to say it again. We should be careful, jealous stewards of classroom time because time on task is the most reliable predictor of increased learning. She went on, people often overestimate what can be done in a day, but underestimate what can be done in a year. With slow, conscientious planning and dedication to a purposeful goal, students are capable of amazing feats. It's simply a matter of time. And the beautiful thing about time is that we're all given an equal daily portion. We know that every minute of the school day is precious. Schools must prioritize, so must teachers. While there are many, many good options, discernment, choosing the best option, is what distinguishes a great school, it's what distinguishes a great homeschool, and it's what distinguishes a great teacher. To achieve this, it's necessary to be discerning over every single element of the schedule and the curriculum. We wouldn't risk the students' precious time on unproven, newfangled ideas. We should build an education on the books and methods that have already stood the test of time. We should bet on the education that has already proven itself and cultivated some of the greatest minds in history. At Highlands Latin School, we try to use every single minute of the school day in a purposeful way. We feel duty-bound to honor our students by not wasting their time or lowering our standards. We know that traditional classrooms are productive, efficient, happy places for both the teacher and the student alike. They're not happy because the child is merely being entertained. They're happy because the child recognizes that his time is not being wasted. Happy because he is being challenged appropriately. Happy because he is achieving and his human nature is being honored with worthwhile tasks and content. In this circumstance, the child is receiving genuine satisfaction for genuine effort, which is truly satisfying and repeatedly rewarding. Nothing breeds success like success itself. Giving a child confidence in his ability early reaps immense rewards. Number 4. Classical literature develops virtue. Reading classical literature develops virtue and helps us better understand the trials and triumphs of mankind. It's important to know why to read, but it's also important to know what to read. Choosing good books is like choosing good food for your children. You would never say, well, it doesn't matter what they eat as long as they're chewing and swallowing. Regarding books and regarding food, we're talking about what they are ingesting. We're talking about what's filling their bodies, what's filling their hearts. Don't we want to give them what's good and wholesome versus junk? For this reason, it's essential to create proper appetites from an early age. I've used this example before. Think of babies. Think about how delicious they think peas and carrots are when they get those first bites. It's not necessary to add sugar and preservatives and additives and salt. The child naturally loves wholesome, good food. The same is true of literature. If we introduce quality literature early, then routinely lead the child to it, he will not only recognize it, he will seek it. The child will discern what is excellent and build a diet around it. The books we read have formed the hearts of men and women from generation to generation. It's important to begin early with quality literature because the student must develop the ability to read these great works. Early introduction to great literature and poetry provides the student comfort with stylistic language, virtuous themes, rich meaning. What a student reads matters. Each book builds on the next in language, in meaning, and in illusion. The steps are small, but they are formative. They are well thought out, and they are absolutely necessary. Our students deserve the same literary experience as previous generations. We must build cultural literacy in our students, give them the community of shared acquaintances known by all educated men throughout time, the heroes who show us virtue and the villains who show us vice. It's not accidental that Horatius and Achilles and Hamlet, even Wilbur and Charlotte, have weathered the passing of time. These are the characters that show us about our human nature. They teach us about the trials and the triumphs that are perennial to men. As Martin demonstrated this morning, the enduring characters of literature are also the tools used by the masters of the literary trade. Without knowledge of the references, great literature becomes less meaningful or even worse, inaccessible to students. The Memoria Press guides were thus developed with the full curriculum in mind. We want students to understand the references made in their books and know the joy of connecting information outside of the bounds of its class or subject. We want students to be able to participate in the great conversation, the term coined by Robert Hutchins of Great Books fame. Our guides pull out information for ready reference in future years and different subjects. With help, our students read comparatively across the curriculum. This gives them entree to great literature, and it forms the bridge on which knowledge changes to virtue. For instance, when the child is trained to recognize a tempting apple in their fairy tales, and then a tempting apple in the Garden of Eden, and then a tempting apple in Hera's Garden of Hesperides, and then a tempting apple that sets into motion the Trojan War, the student, with a multitude of examples, doesn't see a story about an apple. The lesson in virtue is illuminated. The student sees a story about temptation and the consequences of giving into it. Even in stories for our youngest students, we learn about doing your part in The Little Red Hen. We learn to be honest in The Empty Pot. We learn what gluttony looks like with Templeton at the fair. And in Aslan, we see a loving king. These are the lessons that stick. In this way, classical literature is eternally and repeatedly rewarding. It has been vetted and time-tested. Great literature offers us a new lesson, a better perspective, and a fresh kernel of truth with each reading. The student recognizes virtue and vice clearly in great literature, and hopefully is both afforded a victory and spared a defeat because of it. Number 5. Classical education honors the nature of the child. You will see at HLS that students from junior kindergarten through 12th grade have similar expectations and experiences. This continuity and consistency is invaluable. The student knows what his day will look like. He knows what his texts will look like. He knows what his year will look like. He knows what his education will look like. Of this repetition, I often refer to a quote by C.S. Lewis, who says, "A good shoe is a shoe you don't notice." When students are comfortable with the routine and there is a lot of familiarity, the effort can go into what's new, the new content, the new lesson. There is not the added challenge of learning a new system, a new way of doing things. Adults find repetition dull sometimes, but the child does not. Try to recall a child learning something new, perhaps riding a bike, learning a new dive, playing a new song on the piano. The child delights in doing a thing over and over and over again. I'll give you an example. Last spring, my own children discovered an old pogo stick in our garage. The hours that they spent on that thing boggled my mind. I was the judge of more pogo contests than I care to admit. The bouncing was constant. One night, my daughter even, at that time, complained of stomach pains. I was a little alarmed, and I got online to try to figure out what was wrong. After a little more investigation, we simply figured out that she had been pogoing too much, and that she was developing her pogo muscles, her core. This is what she was doing in an attempt at mastery. My point is not that repetition is painful. My point is that repetition, memorization, and recitation are valued components of our curriculum and our culture because they perfectly honor the nature of the child. Repetition is how the child naturally achieves mastery. And demonstration is how he naturally seeks correction and praise. That's why recitation, memorization are so integral to our philosophy. This is how the child innately learns. We should capitalize on this nature of the child. We should select the best content we can and give students the opportunity to memorize, recite, repeat. They enjoy it. But I'll add that if a bit of tedium does creep in, isn't there a lesson there too? Another word for repetition, I think, could be discipline. The athlete who practices her shot day after day, year after year. The adult who sets the early alarm and drives to work day after day, year after year. The parent who makes the meals and does the dishes day after day, year after year. Life requires repetition. And through repetition and discipline, we become able to do a thing well. And we're not able to do that thing well once. We're able to do that thing well consistently. Memoria Press, Mrs. Lowe's publishing company, was named after the Latin word memoria, meaning memory. This was not a flippant decision. Memorization was so integral to her philosophy on education that it essentially defined her life's work. The scripture, facts, poetry, songs, and literary passages that our students memorize are formative and life-giving. They are the truths to which we cling. They are the stories to which we allude. They are the facts to which we refer, and they are the resources with which we persuade. Another great benefit of memorization is that it breeds a unique kind of confidence that's hard to acquire elsewhere. I'll give you another example. At our school, 6th grade students are offered the opportunity, it's an option, to memorize all 70 stanzas of Lord Macaulay's Horatius at the Bridge epic poem. It generally takes students several months to accomplish. The poem is 23 single-spaced type pages, and it takes approximately 20 minutes to recite. We constantly get questions about this. Why would we ask students to do such a thing? It's outrageous. Is there not a better use of time? Well, there are many reasons we offer this challenge. For one thing, it's often the first objective, regulated, long-term goal towards which the student must march. It's not so far off as to be hazy, like get good grades and get into college. The goal is firm, it's tangible, and it's in plain sight. But it's unachievable without steady focus and consistent effort. My son memorized that poem last year, and I memorized about half. After having memorized that poem, my son did not flinch when his dad suggested memorizing the periodic table for Science Olympiad. And when it was time to study 167 countries and their capitals for his geography final, he simply sat down, took a deep breath, and got to work. These were minor tasks compared to learning Horatius. Before, he didn't know what he was capable of accomplishing, but now he does. What a gift he was given. Isn't believing in their ability to do great things the very best gift we can give all our students? Now, in closing, I'm going to practice what I preach and reiterate the 5 key points about classical education and the Memoria Press curriculum. Did I stay under my a little over, 1 minute over. The 5 key points. Classical education offers not only knowledge but wisdom. Latin is the essential core of a classical education. Classical education thrives in a traditional classroom. Classical literature develops virtue. And finally, classical education honors the nature of the child. With these points mastered, I have no doubt you're going to ace the test ahead. And from everyone at Memoria Press, good luck to you.